We should be recording. Again, welcome everyone. We're going to have two presentations today, and these are low-key presentations, one from Sightsavers and one from USAID. And then I'm going to open up the conversation and invite others of you who are working on projects to share a bit of an update on where you are in your project as well. No pressure, just to help us kind of keep up with one another and where we are. And then in the later portion of the meeting, I think we'd like to have a more structured discussion to talk a little bit about what are the next steps, especially in regard to how do we accumulate this body of knowledge that we're producing as some of these evaluations wrap up. So if I can turn this over to Julia Ducat. This is our first presentation from Sightsavers. And Julia, I know you're here. I can't see your bubble at the moment. Do you want me to share the slides or would you like to? And I cannot hear you, Julia.
That's because I didn't unmute. Hi, thanks.
That's okay. Hey.
If you've got them ready, please do go ahead. Otherwise.
Yep. Be happy to.
Amazing. Thank you.
Okay. Are you able to see that well?
I am. I hope everyone else can.
Yeah, I can. Okay. Perfect.
Super. Great. Thank you so much, Julie, and lovely to have this opportunity. I'm going to be speaking today about our project in Sierra Leone, Making Inclusion Count, which is a feasibility study of the CFM TV. I'm presenting on behalf of the broader study team. A few of them, I think, have also managed to join. We've been working with Stephen Kindene in Sierra Leone, and also Elena Schmidt and Anita Jim, I think, have managed to join the call today. Next slide, please. Great. So the overarching objective of our study has been to assess the feasibility of using the CFM-TV as well as also the Washington Group short set to identify children with functional difficulties attending schools in Sierra Leone. Our specific research questions have been to understand the acceptability and feasibility of teachers using either the Washington Group short set questions or the child functioning module teacher version questions to identify children with functional difficulties in schools, to understand what kinds of information the CFM-TV yields about disability prevalence, type, and severity among children, and finally, to understand how useful the data collected by these tools is for schools and for local education stakeholders. And today I'll be speaking mostly to the first two research questions. I'm hoping that next time this group meets, we can add a bit more on this third research question. Next slide, please. So our work has taken place in northern Sierra Leone. Sightsavers has been supporting 45 primary and junior secondary schools in implementing inclusive education in Bombali and Karene districts in the north of the country. Our CFM-TV feasibility study worked with 10 schools. They're indicated with little stars on the map there, equally distributed across the two districts, and an even mix of primary and junior secondary schools. It's been really useful to be working with schools that have this pre-existing relationship with site savers, because it's meant we can be confident that the schools do have a number of learners with functional difficulties. And also we obviously have teachers who do have some understanding of inclusive education. Next slide, please. So our study design has been a multi-staged mixed methods study with a series of stages, each informing and shaping the subsequent stages. I think last time we presented to this group, we shared some very preliminary findings from the first phase of our work, which was an initial pilot of tools with teachers from 2 schools, which really sought to understand the applicability of these tools in the context of Sierra Leone. Following that initial pilot, we began a phase of work around collecting data within schools. This involved firstly a co-creation phase, where drawing on the findings from the initial pilot, we co-created with stakeholders the broader strategy for implementing the use of these tools in 8 additional schools in Sierra Leone. That process then informed our teacher training work, where teachers from study schools were trained on the use of these tools. And this finally led into the school-based data collection itself. Today, I'm going to share some slightly updated findings from our initial pilot of the tools, and then I will share our preliminary findings from the school-based data collection itself. Next slide, please. So starting with that very early initial pilot of the tools, we worked with 18 teachers from 2 schools. So that was 1 primary school and 1 junior secondary school. And together the 18 teachers completed assessments of 270 children on their registers. We ran this process separately for the Washington Group short set and then for the child functioning module teacher version. With the, that got switched around. With the Washington Group short set, we worked with 6 teachers. And with the CFM TV, we worked with 12 teachers. In each case, we paired teachers who were familiar with the same group of learners. And these 2 teachers completed assessments of 30 learners, but they did this working completely independently. We then came back together as a group to try and understand where assessments had been similar and different. We also conducted a series of in-depth interviews to better understand how teachers were interpreting items and how they were making decisions on the scoring of individual children. Next slide, please. So from both the processes, we did experience some challenges in interpreting response options, and particularly teachers struggled to understand the difference between the category some difficulty and a lot of difficulty. And here, one of the challenges was the languages that teachers were using. We were in an area where four different languages were in widespread use, and taking the categories into local languages was really important in working through the differences between those categories. Otherwise, from the Washington Group short set, the feedback was that the tool was quite straightforward to use. Initially, teachers took about 10 minutes to complete an assessment form for a child. By the end of the 30 assessments, this fell to about 6 minutes per child. Using standard cutoffs to determine whether or not a child had a functional difficulty. So using the category of a lot of difficulty or cannot do it all, we found that 2 out of the 90 children that were assessed had functional difficulties, one with difficulty seeing and one with difficulties in multiple domains. I'll share a little more detail on that in the next slide. With the CFM TV, the tool length was quite a bit more challenging, and the skip patterns at the beginning of the tool, so whether or not how to, after answering the first question about whether the child uses glasses, which subsequent questions to answer, that was challenging, but this did improve with practice. Initially, teachers took a lot longer to complete that assessment, starting at 25 minutes per child, eventually falling to about 15 minutes per child. Using standard cutoffs, we found that 33 of the 180 children met the level of difficulty for having a functional difficulty, so that's 18.3%. 21 of those 33 children had difficulty only in one domain. 12 had difficulties across multiple domains. Overall, teachers agreed completely on the assessment of 147 children as not having functional difficulties, and then 6 children having functional difficulties. Next slide, please. So this is a summary of the results from the initial pilot of the Washington Group short set. In the first column, I've provided the percentage of cases in which both teachers who assessed the child agreed completely on all aspects of the assessment. So if teacher 1 said no difficulty in response to the first question, teacher 2 also said no difficulty. And you can see that levels of exact agreement are quite high across all of the questions. The lowest 2 are cognitive and communication. I think in communication there were 11 disagreements on the exact level of difficulty that a child experienced. These figures align very closely with what the teachers shared during the focus group discussions and interviews about which categories they found most straightforward to make decisions about and where they struggled the most. They reported the most difficulty on the question about cognition and communication, and you can see that the levels of disagreement were highest for those questions. In the second column, I've indicated the percentage the percentage of cases where the 2 teachers agreed on whether or not there was a functional difficulty according to those standard cutoffs. So if assessment of the first teacher's response indicated functional difficulty, did the second teacher's response also indicate functional difficulty? You can see that those are very high across the board, almost at 100%. So it's worth noting that even though there was a fair bit more disagreement on scoring for the cognitive domain and for communication, most of that was between no difficulty and some difficulty. So it didn't really result in disagreements about whether or not the child had a functional difficulty using those standard cutoffs. In total, there were 2 children identified as having functional difficulties, and it's worth noting that in both those cases, the teachers did not agree on the presence or absence of functional difficulty. Next slide, please. So here, presented in the same way, are the results from the pilot of the CFM teacher version. For this tool, we had 180 children assessed, and the figures are the percentage of children where the teachers agreed on the assessment. You can see that levels of agreement are quite high for seeing, hearing, walking, and speaking. And especially for those first three, that's quite consistent with what we saw for the Washington Group short set. You can also see that levels of disagreement then begin to increase. There was still a fairly high levels of agreement on the exact category for concentration, for whether or not the child has difficulty making friends, and for learning. And then it falls further to difficulties with controlling behavior, with remembering, it's below 80%. And then for anxiety and depression, there's agreement on the exact level of anxiety or depression about 2/3 of the time, and disagreement on about 1/3 of the children. In the second column, we show whether the teachers agreed, using standard cutoffs, on the presence or absence of functional difficulty. And there's obviously quite a bit more agreement there. So a lot of the disagreement is between the no difficulty and some difficulty categories, rather than between some difficulty and a lot of difficulty. For example, you can see that the levels of disagreement are a little bit higher for remembering, and then for anxiety and depression, but they are still above 90% in all cases. On the far right, I've indicated the number of children where either one or both teachers found functional difficulty using those standard cutoffs. And you can see that the highest numbers are for anxiety and depression, where we do also have the highest levels of disagreement. Overall, 33 of the 180 children met the criteria of functional difficulty, according to at least one of the teachers. But there was only agreement from both teachers for 6 of those 33 children. Next slide, please. So shifting on to the findings from the school-based data collection itself, as I mentioned previously, this was informed by the co-creation workshop and drew on learnings from the initial pilot. We worked with teachers from 8 schools. 4 schools made use of CFM TV and 4 schools made use of Washington Group short set. For each tool, we had 2 primary schools and 2 junior secondary schools. We decided through the co-creation process that it made most sense for class teachers to complete the assessments, as they were most familiar with children. There was a 3-day training process for the teachers in using either tool, which included a general introduction to disability data collection, role play, a pilot using registers, and then they would also develop their individual work plan and schedule for completing the assessments. And then finally, teachers completed paper forms for each child in their class register over a 2-week period in December 2022. And teachers completed the forms based on their knowledge of the children. They weren't asking children any of the questions. In total, so across the 4 schools where Washington Group Short Set was used, there were 30 class teachers and a total of 1,476 children assessed. For CFM TV across those 4 schools, there were 35 teachers who assessed 1,830 children. Next slide, please. So the findings from the school-based data collection, here we are showing the percentage of children, male and female, and overall identified as having a functional difficulty using standard cutoffs. I should say that teachers weren't weren't assessing the forms in terms of whether or not the child had a functional difficulty. That was done on the back end once we received the data. So we can see that for both tools, the proportion of children identified with functional difficulties was quite similar for boys and for girls. It is worth mentioning that for both tools, we did find that a number of children were under the age of 5 and a number were also aged 18 or older. For consistency, we've removed all of those children from the data for both tools. But it is something worth bearing in mind. So for Washington Group Short Set, overall, we see that 1.8% of children had a functional difficulty, and this was very similar for boys and girls. And for the CFM teacher functioning version, overall, 14.7% of children had a functional difficulty. Again, very similar between boys and girls. Next slide, please. Again, with both tools, we can also see that the prevalence of functional difficulty increases with the child's age. With Washington Group Short Set, for those aged 5 to 9, there was only 1 child with a functional difficulty. Those aged 10 to 14, this went up to 1.8%. And for those aged 15 to 17, it was 2.9%. With CFM teacher version, we had 23 children aged 5 to 9 with functional difficulty, so just under 5%. This increased to 18.2% for the 10 to 14 age group and 18.3% for the 15 to 17 age group. So it's interesting that once the children are aged 10 or above, that figure, the prevalence didn't really shift further at all. Next slide, please. In terms of functional difficulty, the individual domains of functional difficulty, the overall rates were very low across the board. We can see 0.5% with difficulty seeing, 0.4 difficulty hearing, 0.5 mobility and cognition. Self-care was the lowest at just 0.1%, and communication was also 0.4%. Next slide, please. For the CFM teacher version, there's a little bit more variation, with just under 1% of children having difficulty seeing. Hearing and mobility were very low. Communication, again, around 1%. We can see that remembering is 2.9%, learning 2.6%, concentrating a bit lower at 1%. Accepting change is 2.8%. Difficulty controlling behavior is a little bit lower, as with making friends, and then the highest levels are with anxiety, with 5.3% of children, and depression, 4% of children. Next slide, please. So here we've tried to pull together across the domains for a little bit of a comparison of the kinds of information that were coming out of the Washington Group short set assessments and the CFM TV assessments. There's obviously quite a bit of similarity across the domains of seeing, hearing, and mobility. The self-care domain doesn't really have an equivalent in CFM TV, but there's also, that was also the very lowest frequency identified. With communication, that's fairly comparable. There's a big difference in terms of the information about cognition with the Washington Group short set, where there's only the single cognition domain. We see that a prevalence of 0.5%, that you can see that with the CFM TV, a lot more children are being identified by asking explicitly about learning and remembering and concentrating. And then obviously the CFM TV provides information on 5 additional domains, which results in identification of quite a few additional children. Next slide, please. Something that I did want to flag in looking at our results is we did see quite a bit of variation in terms of the results across different schools, and importantly also at the level of the individual teacher. What this graph shows is the proportion of children in the class that was of each individual teacher, where the proportion of children identified with functional difficulty. So you can see that there's quite a bit of variation, especially with CFM TV. And you can see that one teacher identified about 90% of the children in their class as having functional difficulty, and a couple more were above 70%. And then there's another cluster of teachers where it's 40 to 60% of children met the criteria for functional difficulty. So that is something that we need to do some more work to try and understand exactly what is happening there. If you remove the teachers where they identified more than 70% of children in their classes as having functional difficulties, that drops the overall prevalence across all of the schools to about 9%. So it makes quite a substantial difference to the overall figures. It is worth noting that these were all inclusive schools. So it is possible that there are substantial variations on the number of children with functional difficulties enrolled in classes, but it is something we'd like to understand a little bit more clearly. Next slide, please. So finally, our current conclusions in terms of acceptability is that the CFM TV was broadly acceptable, although teachers did raise some concerns about length of the tool and also the complexity, particularly with the skip patterns. But overall, data completeness was quite good for the tools that the teachers completed. We do note that teachers did receive an incentive for study participation and completion of the tools. So how these patterns would shift without the incentive present is an important question. In terms of feasibility, again, data completeness was good, although we do note the presence of the incentive, but the levels of variation at the teacher and to a lesser degree at the school level is concerning, and we need to better understand it. We do note the presence of children who are too young to be assessed with either tool in schools, and also for the CFM TV, children who are older than 17. We used a paper-based model, which was quite cumbersome. It generated a lot of paper, and schools certainly struggle in terms of space and systems and facilities for storing paper. So that would need further consideration. Teachers struggled the most with questions on anxiety and depression, on remembering, on accepting change and controlling behavior. And this is somewhere where some additional guidance perhaps and training materials might be useful. And then finally, to note, we used quite a time-consuming training process. We did 3 days of training with teachers, and that might pose significant challenges if tools were rolled out more broadly. Next slide, please. So just in closing, I've flagged here a few areas where I think further exploration would be very valuable, both in terms of our own work on this study and more broadly. Certainly, we'd like to understand the factors driving variation at the school and teacher level more clearly. Another issue that I think is really important is around whether or when or how functional difficulties change over time, and by extension, what kind of frequency of assessment of functional difficulties is necessary. It's worth mentioning that teachers noted that some domains they were assessing in the CFM TV, such as learning, concentrating, remembering, anxiety, and depression, were very much affected by changes at home. For example, if families were struggling with hunger or if there was conflict at home. Another area for investigation is to understand whether, when, and how functional difficulties in these different domains impact on school participation and on academic performance. Really, what implications do they have for education, and by extension, how can they be used for planning and resource allocation? And then finally, how teachers and schools and education systems are able to use functional difficulty data to impact on decisions around the school environment, teaching and learning practices, and then at a higher level, policy planning and resourcing. That's it from my side. Thank you very much, everyone. And Julie, back to you.
Thank you, Julia, so much. Let me ask very quickly, are there any questions very specifically about that while I have the slides up here for Julia on any of the specifics of the study? I know we'll get time to chat. I can't see people while I'm sharing my screen, so please feel free just to someone let me know or just speak up. Okay. Julia, I had one question, and then I see Henrik has a hand as well. One of your earlier slides mentioned that there was quite a bit of difficulty around the response categories, but that bullet also intimated that it was likely a translation issue my question is, once the translations into the 4 different languages were completed, did you find that challenge did it go away? Was it just a translation issue, or were there other difficulties with the response categories?
Thanks, Julie. I actually see that my colleague Stephen Kinden has managed to join. I'm hoping he would respond to that question for us.
Okay.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be part of this meeting. Yes, the response options were actually influenced, by the scale people use in the communities that we use. So we discovered that some difficulty and a lot of difficulty, some interpreted it as almost the same kind of, issues. So what we did was to use their own local languages and use scenarios using a scale of measure, using on a number of things, like light intensity in a room, the ability for someone to get out of a room if there is an accident, like a fire. But once we are able to use those scales to explain it to them, it became completely very easy for them to handle. And well, we did not experience any difficulty after that. Thank you.
Okay. Henok?
Thank you so much for the very interesting presentation. My question is, I have 2 questions. One is that you said that one of these objectives was to assess acceptability of the tools. And we know that this Washington group short set is already validated and accepted, and yeah. So, but it was meant to be used with adults. Now you have tested it with children. That's really good. And so was the intention to test acceptability when used with children specifically? And also, it has been stated by the Washington group, for example, that the Washington group short set questionnaires having 6 domains will enable us to identify the larger majority of functional difficulties related to daily activities. But now when we see the results that you presented, that there is the CFM TV version seems to enable us to identify, in fact, much more functional difficulties. So are we now questioning the statement that we had from before, saying that the Washington group short set enables us to identify the larger majority of functional difficulty? Yes, I would also expect to see higher functional difficulty prevalence when we use CFMT TV version compared to, because it has more questions, more it's expire. But the interesting point was your comparison about remembering and concentration, in which case also that we see that there was higher prevalence when used CFM-TV was used. What could be the clarification about that? Is it a training given to teachers? Is it, yeah, any clarification? Thank you so much.
I assume that question is more for the Washington group than it is for Julia. But what I would first say is the short set, we acknowledge that it is intended to pick up and has shown to pick up the majority of adults with disabilities. And so I don't think we advocate for using the short set for children. And you, as your second point is, the more questions you ask, the more you're going to kind of pull in. I also think that when you know, there is something to be said for when you are being asked the child functioning questions, the structure of many of those questions, not all of them, but are, you know, compared to other children this age, or the structure of the question and the number of questions and the more detail, especially in the cognition section, is going to create a situation where you get higher numbers. So I don't think that we would suggest that somehow now the short set is not working well, because it wasn't supposed to work for necessarily for children anyway. In a census situation, that's probably all you're going to get. And I think many of the results that Julia shared, especially in the domains of seeing, hearing, walking, and I believe it was communication, there was a lot of agreement between the two sets in those domains. So I'm, you know, that gives me some confidence in the use of that in a very general way. I'm not sure. Anyone else want to jump in here?
Could I add
Yeah,
a
go
little
ahead,
bit
Julia.
to that, Julie? Yeah, just to add, the reason that we chose to include the Washington Group short set was really because it's short, and I think we do see it being used in a lot of different ways in a lot of different contexts. And we wanted to understand partly how much more difficult it would be to use the CFM TV, which is designed for use by teachers in schools with children of this age range, relative to the sort of shortest, easiest set of questions available, which does often get used, even though it's not intended for use by teachers or in schools. Interestingly, we did learn that as part of the annual school census, there was also I think a pilot with some schools of using the Washington Group short set in their annual school census. So that's really where that decision came from. And I think it was helpful to see that although the tool is longer and a little bit more complicated, it didn't seem to be all that much more challenging to use. I think, Julie, you've spoken to all the other points.
Well, thank you, Julia. Thank you to the entire Site Savers and Sierra Leone team. Congratulations. It's I found the presentation quite comprehensive and quite interesting. I'm glad that you're seeing some of the results that you are seeing. Let me turn it over to Anne from the School to School International and USAID team, who's going to share a bit. And she is going to share her screen, so I will go off screen. Over to you, Anne.
Thanks, Julie. Hi, everyone. I will just pull up my screen for a moment. I've been having some connectivity issues, so we'll say hello and then leave my camera off for the duration. But we're very excited to be sharing some findings with you from our child functioning teacher version CFM-TV validity study. We have finished data collection at this point and are in the process of writing up our final report. So that should be coming out shortly. I will give you a quick overview of what I'm hoping to share. I'll hand it over to Leah and Rebecca from USAID to talk a bit more in depth about the purpose of the study. And then we'll give some background on the tool, not that you all need that much, and a bit more background on our study design, and then get into some of those preliminary results. And before jumping into all of that, I will say that this study has been funded through the All Children Reading Grand Challenge for Development, which is in partnership with USAID, World Vision, and Australian Aid. So that's kind of the basis of where our study is taking place. And then I'll hand it over to Leah and Rebecca to talk a bit more about the purpose and some of the thinking behind this specific validity study of the CFM-TV.
Thanks, and hi everyone. My name is Leah Maxon. I'm a Senior Inclusive Education Advisor in USAID Center for Education, and joined here by my colleague Rebecca Pagel, who's a Senior Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning Advisor, also at USAID in the Center for Education. So Rebecca and I have been fortunate to work with our partners from the All Children Reading Grand Challenge for Development and School to School International on this study. We just want to share a little bit about the rationale, what drove us to pursue this study. So USAID began thinking about commissioning a study of the CFM-TV in early 2021. In the fall of 2020, we had released updated education reporting guidance that required disability disaggregates to all person-level indicators, including at the primary level with young learners. We were really interested in collecting information and knowing how our education programs were including children with disabilities and what the learning outcomes were of children with disabilities participating in USAID-funded education activities. And we had guidance available for partners on the availability of tools to use with caregivers and older individuals who could self-report, such as the CFM and the Washington Group short set. But a large portion of our primary grade education programs takes place in school settings where we just don't have access to parents and caregivers to produce that information that the CFM and CFM-TV require. So, or the CFM requires. So USAID staff and partners were asking for this guidance specifically on what tools could be used with teachers to collect the data on children in school settings. And so this led us to commissioning a pilot of the CFM-TV for the first purpose, which you see here on the PowerPoint, which is to evaluate whether the CFM-TV results are adequate for reporting reading outcomes disaggregated by disability status at an aggregated level. The second purpose of our study is to collect validity evidence to understand the circumstances under which the CFM-TV might provide adequate information on learners' functional difficulties. At the time, there wasn't much data on the validity of the CFM-TV, and so we worked with School to School International to design this validation study that Anne will talk more about, hoping that if it worked well, we might learn under what circumstances USAID activities could use it to disaggregate learning outcomes by disability status. And let me turn it over to Rebecca to talk a little bit about Nepal specifically.
Thanks, Leah. So the two purposes that Leah has talked about already are quite in line with the original intended purposes of the CFM-TV, which is really to provide prevalence information, as we all know. So disaggregating data is an appropriate purpose that the CFM-TV was designed for. But as this was happening, we were working with our country office in Nepal, and the government was working with our staff in Nepal, saying, hey, we are going to consider the CFM-TV data including it in our EMIS system. And not only do we want to use it to disaggregate other outcomes of our learners in what is an individual level education management information system, but we also want to know if we can use this tool as a screening tool. So their question was, can we not only use the CFM-TV to add data in our education management information system on students' functional difficulties, but can we also use it as a way to screen them and flag them for further diagnostic testing? So because the mission was coming to us with that question, we added an element to this study, which Anne will talk about in a minute, to help us to understand if the CFM-TV could also be used as a screening tool. And we added this question because this is not a purpose for which the CFM-TV had before then been validated. So we were wondering if we could use the tool for this new purpose. And I'm going to hand it back to Anne to talk a little bit about how we designed the study to meet these three purposes.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Leah, for that context. I think it's always, especially with validity studies, it's really helpful to keep the purpose of the study in mind. So a little bit of background, as you all know, this study is really looking at this unvalidated tool, the CFM-TV, which is 15 questions that's filled out by a teacher about his or her students. In our particular study, We had enumerators coming to schools, and teachers filled out the CFM-TV about a subsample of their students on tablets. So we took a different approach rather than paper-based. But to get at the study purposes, we had several research questions that kind of guided us through this, with several sub-questions, which I have not listed here. The first research question was to understand what teachers' interpretations of the CFM-TV questions were, to get a better sense of their interpretations of the different domains, how consistent that might be with the interpretations intended by the CFM and the CFM-TV and the Washington group when the tool was created, to see what kinds of comparisons teachers might be doing, whether they were doing normative comparisons where they compared to a group of other learners, or if they were doing criterion-based comparisons where they had sort of a reference, a standardized reference, and were making comparisons against that. We were also looking at research question 2, which is, to what extent are teacher ratings on the CFM-TV influenced by teacher and school characteristics? So trying to understand if there was anything about teachers' familiarity with the students, their level of experience as a teacher, the class size, the school type, several other different factors, also including teachers' attitudes towards learners with disabilities or inclusive education in general, that might affect or moderate the way that teachers provided ratings on the CFM-TV. And then finally, we wanted to look at how consistent learners' functional difficulty or disability classifications were as identified by teachers on the CFM-TV. In addition, we also looked at how primary caregivers might have given a functional difficulty rating on the CFM, which is another validated tool that the Washington group has created. And then also looking at medical screeners. So this is that additional component that Rebecca just mentioned, to see how the CFM-TV ratings and then results from medical screenings compared, how consistent they were, and then what types of factors might moderate those findings as well. So to explore all of this, we had several different tools. We had a package of tools that we administered to teachers. So the first was the CFM-TV. Teachers also completed cognitive interviews in which we asked them more detailed questions about their interpretations of the different domains, how they were coming to make the difficulty ratings for each child, and get a better sense of what they were thinking while they were completing the CFM-TV. Teachers also completed a key informant interview that got at more detailed information around their teaching experience, their attitudes towards teaching learners with disabilities, their general thoughts about resources for this, and how that might play into the CFM-TV, as well as their perceptions of the CFM-TV as a usable tool for the purposes that we've outlined. They also completed a teacher survey. And I'll just note that not all teachers completed cognitive interviews and key informant interviews. There's only one teacher per school who completed each of those tools, but all teachers completed the teacher survey and CFM-TVs. We also had a set of tools that were administered to primary caregivers, which included a survey about the primary caregivers, the learner, their households, demographic factors, other background information like that. And then also included the child functioning module, or the CFM, which primary caregivers completed for their learners. And then we matched with CFM-TV results. And then finally, the last component was the medical screening data. We held medical screening fairs in which children were screened for vision, hearing, and mobility in a subset of samples, a subset of schools in our study as well. I think Leah and Rebecca gave a bit of background about the key activities, but just to quickly revise, planning and kind of development of the study design went up until July 2022 of last year. We piloted our tools, the teacher and primary caregiver tools, last year in August of 2022. And then prepared for data collection in 38 schools in November and December of 2022. I'll note that was kind of in the middle of the 2022-2023 school year. And then as we continued adding on the components to our study, we went through another round of IRB medical approval, and then collected medical data and conducted these medical screening camps in 20 schools in May of 2023, so just a couple of months ago. And since then, we've been working on analysis, are working on our final report, and we'll be having a dissemination event in August. So we'll get into the results a little bit. I want to give you just a little bit of background about our sample. In total, we sampled 58 schools, 38 in round one, which was December 2022, and 20 in round two, which was the medical screening collection, which was just a couple months ago. In total, we ended up collecting data from 157 teachers. And between those two data collection rounds, we have 2,222 records, a very nice square number there, from CFMTVs for that amount of learners. We were able to match CFMTVs with responses from 629 primary caregivers. And then we were able to match medical and CFMTV records for 408 learners. I think we were able to screen far more students than just 408. This is a service that we wanted to provide to all students in the schools that we were sampling, in order to not withhold any types of services from anyone. So the total number of learners that were actually screened was 1,489. But for the purposes of the study, we limited the records that we included to those between, or those for learners who were in grades 2, 3, and 4, because that was more in line with the purpose of our study. Also wanted to note that these were spread across 4 districts in Nepal. So this doesn't include all of the districts in Nepal, but does include a few. The central province where Kathmandu is located, Bagmati province, is where most of the schools were sampled, as well as Madhya province, which is more in the southern region. We also sampled from a variety of different types of schools. So of those 58 schools, 23 were mainstream schools, 19 were mainstream schools with resource classrooms, 11 schools were special schools for learners with particular types of disabilities. And then 5 of those schools were madrasas, which are religious institutions, but excuse me, but also function as schooling for learners in that southern region, Madhya province. So before getting into the specific data, I'll just give you a synopsis of some of the results that we've seen, and then go into the data more specifically itself. So looking first at research question 1, what are teachers' interpretations of the CFMTV questions? We saw that the CFMTV produced rates of functional difficulty a bit higher than the national estimates. That's just for context. In general, we saw that the CFMTV indicated that 22% of learners had a functional difficulty, and data from UNICEF's multi-cluster survey of 2019 indicates that the national rate is around 13%. I think the higher rate on our study is probably a function of where we sampled learners, but just for context, it's helpful to know that what that national average is. The domains that we saw where teachers rated learners with the highest rates of functional difficulty were hearing, communicating, learning, and remembering. And I think this kind of echoes some of the things that Julia was presenting in her study as well. And as we talked to teachers about how they interpreted these different domains, most of their interpretations were heavily based on classroom activities. And so communicating, learning, and remembering all often were referenced in terms of remembering to do homework or being able to answer questions in the classroom, or being able to grasp new concepts that had been taught. And in general, teachers seem to have positive comments about the CFM TV when asking about how usable it might be, but we aren't sure if they completely understood the tool's intent. So a lot of what we saw was that teachers maybe didn't have a very deep understanding of disability. We provided them with some background materials about the social model of disability, the medical model of disability, and then an outline of the different functional domains. But this was often new content and new material for teachers, and they may not have internalized it and may not have understood what the purpose of this was, that it was more for potentially national level disaggregates rather than pre-screening and identifying a specific learner. In regard to research question 2, the extent to which teacher ratings on the CFM-TV are influenced by teacher characteristics or school level characteristics. We took a look and found that some factors that are associated with how teachers provide ratings, whether or not the odds increase or decrease of a teacher giving a learner a functional difficulty, include school type, which makes sense, the teacher's gender, the teacher's familiarity with the learner, if the teacher had already received some sort of training in the functional difficulty domains, the teacher's level of comfort with learners with disabilities, and then if the teacher had received any kind of training in inclusive education. So these all played a role in how we found an association between the rates of teachers providing rating learners as having functional difficulties and these different factors. And then for the final question, how consistent are learners' functional difficulties or disability classifications in comparison with the CFM and medical screeners? We saw that teachers tend to underreport functional difficulties compared to medical screenings, which indicates to me that likely this tool is not an appropriate tool for a pre-screening, since that means we're missing several learners who might need assistance. Teachers, however, were more likely than primary caregivers to rate a child as having a functional difficulty in almost all of the domains. And then several factors influenced these ratings and the rates of agreement between teacher ratings on the CFM-TV and primary caregiver ratings on the CFM. And that include, again, school type, teacher's familiarity with the learner, the class language of instruction, if the teacher had training in functional difficulty domains, if they had exposure to persons with disabilities, either in their household or in other ways. And then if the primary caregiver reported that the child had a medical diagnosis, that seemed to kind of triangulate some of the ways that teachers and primary caregivers agreed with their ratings. So I think we've already been talking for 20 minutes. Julie, is it okay if we continue?
Yes, please do.
Okay, all right. So we'll get into some of the actual data at this point, and kind of work our way back from research question 3. So again, looking at the rates at which CFM-TVs agreed or were consistent with medical ratings. We saw that generally the CFM-TV tended to under-identify learners with difficulties compared to these medical screenings. In vision, the CFM-TV identified just under 13% of learners in the sample as having a functional difficulty, whereas medical screenings indicated that 16% had an impairment. In hearing, only 10% or almost 11% of CFMTVs indicated that learners had a functional difficulty in hearing, whereas the rates of medical screening were much higher, 23%. And then in mobility, only 2.8% of CFMTVs indicated that learners had a functional difficulty, but medical screenings indicated that 4.3% did. So these differences were all statistically significant. And it's interesting to consider these differences, especially in hearing. I think one factor to keep in mind is that this data was collected, as I mentioned, in May 2023, and it was collected essentially about a week after the new school year had started. So we saw that teachers were often a little bit less familiar with their learners than they were during the December round of data collection, which I think probably does influence the ways in which teachers were able to reliably rate or accurately rate these physical abilities or the physical disability difficulties of their learners. We took a look at the true positive, true negative, false positive, and false negative rates of agreement between the CFMTV and medical ratings. I have this all listed here, but a quick synopsis is that the CFMTV ratings were true. Either they like truly indicated a positive impairment or they truly indicated a negative impairment for 93.2% of vision records, much lower in hearing where the rate was 69.6%, and then kind of in the middle, 83.8% of mobility records. We also ran a kappa coefficient, which is looking at agreement between raters on this. The highest kappa coefficient was found for vision, with a coefficient of 0.74, which is kind of a moderate rating, or sorry, a substantial rating. And then for hearing and mobility, those coefficients were 0.54 and 0.41, which is considered moderate, just over moderate for mobility. So we see that rates of agreement were pretty good for vision, but definitely less so for hearing and for mobility when comparing the CFMTV and these medical ratings. We also looked at the CFMTV versus CFM ratings. So overall, and then for the physical domains, we saw that of this sample, which is 629 records for learners, 31.8% were rated as having any kind of functional difficulty by teachers on the CFMTV, and 27.5% were rated by primary caregivers on the CFM. The individual levels of functional difficulty rating dropped quite a bit from that. In vision, it was 9.9% from teachers and 10.6% from primary caregivers. And that was the only domain in which primary caregivers had a slightly higher rate of indicating functional difficulty than teachers. In hearing, it was 9.4% for teachers and 8.5% for primary caregivers. And then in walking, it was 3.6% for teachers and 2.9% for primary caregivers. So again, teachers were more likely to provide a functional difficulty rating than primary caregivers in these specific domains. That was also true for the ratings in the cognitive and then psychosocial domains of communicating, learning, concentrating, remembering, accepting change, behavior, making friends, and anxiety. There was no difference, however, in the rates of teacher versus primary caregiver functional difficulty ratings for depression. And that is likely because the rate at which teachers responded, I don't know about depression, was much higher than for other functional domains. So for anxiety, the rate was 8.6% of teachers who said, I don't know about a learner. And in depression, it was 7.8%. But I think one thing in thinking about and reflecting on Julia's presentation is that we see kind of similar prevalence trends, I think, with teachers on the CFM TV as she presented, where there seem to be higher ratings of functional difficulty in communicating, learning, concentrating, and remembering, especially as compared to how primary caregivers are providing those ratings. So looking, I'm going to go through this very quickly and not get into this large table in too much detail, but essentially this a star indicates that there was a significant association between the functional difficulty rating or the rating in the domain and these different factors. And the factors which had associations with more than half of the domains included the school type, the teacher familiarity, the class language, specifically if the class language was not Nepali, it was another local language. If the teacher had training in the functional difficulty domains, if the teacher had a person in their household who was a person with a disability, and then again, if the primary caregiver said that the child had a medical diagnosis. So these all seem to be factors that influence the rate at which teachers and primary caregivers agree on their ratings. Looking at research question 1, just overall, the teacher ratings. This was the full sample of 2,222 records that teachers provided. We saw that teachers, again, as I mentioned, resulted in a higher prevalence than the national estimate, which was about 13%. As I said, I think this is a little bit driven by our sample. If you remove the records from the medical screening round of data collection, in which we were specifically looking for learners who had medical diagnoses, the rate drops to only 20%, but that's still quite a bit higher than that national average. Again, the rates were the domains where we saw the highest prevalence ratings were in communicating, learning, and remembering. And then, as we saw with the full sample, teachers generally tended to respond, or less than 5% of teachers responded, I don't know, in trying to rate the full sample of learners in this. One thing also to note is that in our cognitive interviews and key informant interviews, teachers seem to have the most difficulty interpreting, remembering, concentrating, accepting change, and controlling behavior, which I think echoes the finding that Julia presented to us earlier in Sierra Leone as well. Looking at a few factors that were modifying some of the teacher ratings, we definitely saw that school type had an effect on teacher ratings, which isn't surprising, as I mentioned. So over here we have the proportion of learners from each school who were rated as having a functional difficulty. In mainstream schools, it was 8.2%. In mainstream schools with resource classrooms, it was 21.4%. In special schools, it was 63.8%. And then in madrasas, it was 1.2%. So one thing that I find interesting is that learners in madrasas were so much less likely to be rated as having a functional difficulty. I think there are some cultural things going on in those types of schools, which I'm trying to explore a little bit more with some of our program partners. But the other thing that I find really interesting is that special schools, well, it's not surprising that they have such a higher proportion of learners with functional difficulties as compared to other schools. But what does surprise me is that this figure isn't closer to 100%. Since special schools are schools for learners with particular disabilities, I would have expected that to be a little bit closer to 100%, but as we spoke with teachers and learned a little bit more about their interpretations of the different domains, it was really clear that teachers in special schools didn't necessarily think that their learners always had a functional difficulty, because they were often comparing learners specifically with other learners in that school as compared to learners in a mainstream school or a different type of school. So the role of that normative comparison, I think, is really important in understanding the ways that teachers in special schools were providing ratings on functional difficulties for their learners. We also, I think I just have the breakdown of the proportion of learners with functional difficulties according to some of these other factors. One thing that I think is really interesting is that teachers with above average comfort teaching learners with learners with disabilities is quite a bit lower than the proportion among teachers who say they have below average comfort teaching learners with disabilities. We assess this through quite a few different questions on the teacher survey to try to understand their level of comfort with these different learners with disabilities. And these were classified as the disability classifications as outlined by the government of Nepal. So I find that quite interesting. And then kind of conversely, if the teacher had received at least one training in inclusive education, they were more likely to rate learners as having a functional difficulty. So among that group, 28.1% reported that they had learners with functional difficulties in their classroom, whereas teachers without inclusive education trainings, only 11.2% reported that they had learners with functional difficulties. I think this again may be kind of a factor of school type, but is interesting to see that difference as well. And then to just talk a little more in depth about the specific findings from teacher interviews, looking at teacher ratings specifically. As I mentioned before, teachers sort of indicated that they were comparing learners to peers and non-peers, as opposed to having some sort of a standardized reference or like a criteria that they were comparing learners to. In mainstream schools, they were mostly comparing with other mainstream learners, and then it was sort of more mixed about how resource class teachers and special school teachers were making those comparisons. If it was comparisons of learners in those particular classrooms and schools, or if they were comparing with mainstream learners. We also saw that in those psychosocial domains, a lot of the ways that teachers were interpreting the questions had to do with conforming to cultural norms, and specifically conforming to obedience or following teachers' directions in the classroom. So that is something to take into consideration in terms of how teachers might be referencing this. They're not necessarily thinking about how learners function at home and behave at home, but specifically just in the classroom. And then, as I said before, some teachers expressed that there was some confusion around the psychosocial domains, and almost all teachers said that they request that training in these different domains, all of the domains, but specifically those psychosocials, would be really beneficial. As I said before, they were provided with some of that background material outlining a little bit more about functional difficulty versus disability, different disability models of definitions. And that text was often quite dense. And in areas where the local language was not Nepali, it was pretty difficult for some of the teachers to understand. And then thinking about the CFM-TV's usability, how teachers felt about the tool and its purpose in their classrooms. Most of the teachers felt that the CFM-TV was pretty easy to use on the tablet. It helped them think about their learners' needs individually. Many of them said it was helpful for them to reflect about one specific learner and think through all of these different aspects for that one particular learner, which isn't something that they had necessarily been doing before. It also often changed the way that they thought about and defined disability. Many teachers had not been introduced to kind of like the social versus medical model of disability before, and hadn't considered like the full array of functioning domains as something to consider in how a child functioned and whether or not they might have a functional difficulty or a disability. And then finally, as I said before, almost all of the teachers thought it would be helpful to have training on the tool and the functional difficulty domains. And they also added that if they were receiving training on that, they should also be receiving some training on how to accommodate learners with disabilities so that they might be prepared to do that, because many of the teachers, especially in mainstream schools, felt that they were under-resourced and didn't have any kind of background in providing that support to learners. So that's kind of a quick and very broad overview of what we've been seeing in our study so far. And I would be happy to answer any questions or chat more about some of these findings.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thank you to the entire team. Are there any questions specifically on the project we've just heard about?
Just one quick one. This is Jennifer. When on the medical screeners, were they using the same tool as the children, or were they using something more medical? And if so, then what were they using the same response categories, or did you have to do something to kind of make them equivalent?
Yeah, we were using, so on the medical screenings we had for vision, they were doing a Snellen acuity chart, and they were doing some refraction as well. In hearing, they were conducting pure tone audiometry tests. And then in mobility, they used a tool called the Rapid Assessment of Mobility. And we used classifications for severity that aligned with previous studies that have been done that use similar tools. And then kind of checked with our medical screening team if those were consistent with what was commonly used in Nepal for those different classifications as well.
One other way you can look at that data would be to see where on the standard medical screening do the teacher responses fall. So they may be using a lower kind of level because of the nature of why they're doing it. But when you kind of can get everything on the same scale, they may be, I'm assuming they're going to pick up more kids, but it may not be that great a difference when you actually compare it on more similar terms. So, but you have to do it the other way. You have to kind of find where are the teachers' responses on the medical screening scale.
Okay. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you for that. I might follow up with you to ask a few more questions about that.
Sure.
I saw Stephen's hand first, and then over to Edward, and then to Henrik.
Thank you so much. That was really very interesting findings. And, when I listened to that presentation, I found a number of things that were very similar to the kind of things we came across in Sierra Leone. Teachers' gender. We discovered that female teachers actually tend to know children that were not in their classes. And they contributed quite a lot, especially during our pilot testing of the tools that we used. And also there was this familiarity. And because of that, we actually decided to settle more for class teachers because they spent more contact time with the teachers compared to subject specialist teachers. So that was very interesting. And of course, prior training, people who have had prior exposure to training in disability and disability data collection, we are actually able to find something. But what I found more interesting again was the cultural norms. There are sometimes teachers actually bring in cultural norms, when they measure certain areas, like making friends or even being able to fit into society. Because some teachers thought that for some students who argue a lot or ask a lot of questions, some of them actually consider them as children having a kind of functional difficulties because they are not able to fit more into society because they challenge their authorities or their elders. Thank you so much. That was a very interesting findings.
Thank you. Thank you for that reflection on some of those similarities. I think Enoch also has his hand up. Oh, Edward, sorry, Julie.
Thank you very much. Sorry for joining late. So if I join late and my question is redundant, please ignore it. But just wanted to clarify. So we, World Vision, we had a program in Nepal where we screened 25,000 kids using the child functioning module, not the teacher version, but using teachers. And what we found is that when we then did a medical screening afterwards, and the medical screening only came up with we identified about 2,000 kids who screened positive as having a lot of difficulty or couldn't do at all. And then we referred to medical screening. And we found out that at the end of the day, we only made 100 or just over 100 significant, what I would call significant medical interventions, as glasses or hearing aids or mobility devices. So one of the things that we'd speculated at the time was that the teacher that overestimated the severity or incidence of functional issues because they wanted the kids to get screened. They're like, oh, if in doubt, like let's push them up to that. So I just wondered if that had been, and you felt that was an issue in this study, and yeah, those and just I assumed that you were using the I didn't hear that because I wasn't here at the very start of that presentation, that you were using a lot of difficulty or cannot do at all as the threshold for identification. But yeah, just be interested to learn more about that. Thanks.
Thanks, Edward. I think we may have well, I think we also spoke with that was the Sakai project, right?
Yes.
Yeah, some of those schools actually participated in this study as well, so there's a bit of overlap there. But so in terms of teachers over or under rating, we saw when we looked specifically at the domains of seeing, hearing, and mobility, and the comparison with medical diagnoses there, that teachers were underreporting a bit. But I did also look at the rate of overall functional difficulty rating by a teacher, which was much higher than what those medical diagnosis ratings were. So I think it depends on how you're defining things. But again, looking at that very specific, those specific domains of seeing, hearing, and mobility, teachers tended to underreport as compared to the medical screenings. I also mentioned that might be because it was right after the school year started, and so teachers hadn't spent a lot of time with children in the classrooms at that point. So that's another factor to consider in all of this.
And so so the teachers were tending to overestimate on some of the other domains, like, concentration, remembering, communicating. Is that right?
Yeah, we saw that the prevalence rates overall for some of the other domains were higher for communicating, learning, and remembering, as opposed to seeing, hearing, and mobility. They were a bit lower in those categories.
Because I guess that makes sense from a teaching perspective, is you're saying that, like, those kids who you obviously, they can't answer questions that you're asking, or they don't seem to remember content that you delivered yesterday. That's more in their comfort zone in terms of identification, and less in the comfort zone of a medical professional.
Yeah, exactly. And if you have a class size of more than 30 learners, I think the average class size for teachers in this study was just under 40 learners. That's pretty large. And so if you have a lot of learners who are sitting in the back, they might not be as familiar with like if the child can actually see or if the child is able to hear because maybe they're distracted in doing other things, or there's a lot of other factors going on there.
And then, yeah, there might be crossover, so that the kid may have problems seeing, but they're screened by the teacher as having problems remembering or something like that. It's just that they can't see the content, so they're not acquiring that knowledge as quickly as other kids or something.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Edward. Hanok? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Very interesting study indeed. So my question is regarding the prevalence found using the medical screening and the prevalence from CFM-TV. And we see that from the medical screening, we found higher prevalence. What we see usually is that functional difficulty or disability reported using medical screening gives less prevalence than but this seems to give us a bit different finding compared to expectation. So I would like to know if this was maybe influenced by the provision of assistive device to the children. So for example, in medical diagnosis, maybe those persons were diagnosed and then without having that assistive device, they were found to have functional difficulty or disability. But then when we administer the CFM-TV, that some of the children might have been using their assistive devices, and then they when asked using assistive device, do you have this or does this child have this difficulty, then the answer might have been different. So how was this? Do you think that these answers or findings were influenced by provision of assistive device? And secondly, why did we want to use children from special schools in order to examine agreement between CFM and medical screening? Because as to my understanding, if these children from special schools are actually children that have, if this special school has schools for children with functional difficulties, so we will be definitely find so many children with functional difficulty, if not all of them. So why did we not exclude these children that go to special schools? Do you think we would have found different findings if we did not include children from these special schools? Thank you.
Thank you, Hanak. Okay, so your first question is about assistive devices, and then your second question is about inclusion of special schools. So I'll answer the first question first about assistive devices. So when we conducted the medical screenings and the CFM-TV data collection at the same time, so specifically on the same day. So at that point, teachers probably or learners and their parents probably would not have had a chance to go and receive some sort of assistive device, maybe glasses or a hearing aid or mobility assistance or something like that. And I haven't looked at the way that that might influence some of these responses, but you know, the CFM-TV question does ask whether or not the learner is using any kind of assistive device. So I think I can take a look at how those responses from the teacher align with some of the information that we got from medical screenings, if an assistive device was then like recommended for the specific learner. So I don't have a clear answer about how that influenced things for you, but it is a good way for me to continue looking at this analysis, and I'll make a note to include that as we move forward. So thank you for that consideration. And then in terms of the inclusion of the special schools, we were looking for the medical screening, we were looking specifically for a sample where we would get a certain number of learners where we would get a medical diagnosis. And that is why we included those special schools, because we felt fairly certain that we would be able to get that medical diagnosis to compare what the teacher said with what the medical diagnosis actually was. We had a lot of internal discussions about going back and forth on that, which schools we should sample. We ended up trying to find schools with higher student populations to be able to cast a wider net, and then also included those special schools and then mainstream schools with resource centers to make sure that we would find learners who did have some sort of medical diagnosis. And I think for the context in Nepal, I think it's kind of mixed in terms of whether or not learners have actually been to a physician and received some sort of medical diagnosis before. Like looking at parent response rates about whether or not their children had received a medical diagnosis, specifically in special schools, it's not 100%. So we felt we were still at least providing a service to provide these learners with a diagnosis that they may not have had received before, and then be linked to further treatment, even in those special schools, as opposed to just mainstream schools. But I do think, like, in terms of the prevalence findings, if we had not included special schools, the prevalence would look very different for both the CFM-TV and for the medical diagnoses. But I think for that particular research question, we weren't especially interested in kind of like representative prevalence within Nepal. We were really looking more at the consistency between the teachers and the medical outcomes there.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Guy, if you have a quick question, I invite you to pose your question.
A very quick question.
Thank you.
I mean, the purpose of this research was to establish if CFM TV could be incorporated within the government EMIS. Can you tell us at this stage what your recommendations are going to be, very broadly? Over.
Sure. So I think we were looking to understand whether or not this could be used first as sort of a national, a way to disaggregate learning outcomes on a national level. I think we would say to that, yes, with some caveats and with some recommendations about how to move forward with that, and with some considerations for inclusion of specific domains rather than others, focusing more on seeing, hearing, walking. And then we have some questions about the inclusion of some of the psychosocial domains. In terms of using the tool as individual identification in EMIS, I think at this point our recommendation would be no, given what we saw with teachers under-reporting versus the medical outcomes in those specific domains of seeing, hearing, and walking. That's the short answer, I guess.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks for the thumbs up, Kai. Thank you to both teams for your presentations. you know, I was a little worried we were not going to be able to fill this 2 hours, but I think I underestimated how interesting, you know, we're at the results stage for these projects and we're really digging into some of these findings and, you know, it's raising even new questions. And so we certainly filled up the time. My my intention was to open the floor and to have some of the other groups that are working on other projects provide a bit of an update. But because we're a little bit short on time, I'd like to move to a different conversation here that is also on the agenda. And that involves what we're going to do about results. But before I start that conversation, I would like to invite anyone who didn't introduce themselves and their organization in the chat. Maybe you joined a little bit later or have had connection problems. If you can do that, that would be wonderful. I'm simply going to capture that information and put it in our roster of attendees, and that will make sure that you are on our next email out about meetings in this group. Thank you. Okay, so back to results. So, you know, one of the things that the Washington group is thinking about is how do we communicate out some of the very high level results that our partners are seeing across the projects without it becoming a full-time job writing something up and pulling it together, without it becoming out of date the moment that we finally produce it, and in a way that, you know, the partners are comfortable sharing the level of information, knowing that each group has its own mechanisms for disseminating the information and your project results. So the idea here that we're coming into the meeting and proposing is that that a smaller group, a subcommittee of interested people working with the Washington Group Secretariat, that's Jennifer Cordell and myself. If you are willing to meet with us outside of these larger meetings and kind of come up with some ideas for disseminating results that we could then bring back to the general group. This would kind of reduce the burden. We wouldn't necessarily all have to get together, and maybe we could have some very focused conversations and make some decisions. That's my proposal out. There may be other ways to accomplish this, and I invite any other thoughts. And Jennifer, feel free to jump in here as well and add a little more context if you like.
Just briefly, one suggestion I would make is that now that people are kind of finishing, we didn't, you know, we went through 2, that we're probably going to have to meet more than once a year. And so maybe think about a fall meeting where we can, I think it's good. We don't want to, you know, to get them all in, we'd have to make these presentations really short. And I think there's something to be gained from getting the richness of it. So maybe we can record these, people can listen to them if they can't make it. So that would be one suggestion. You know, after our initial set of meetings, we put together that guidance document that you have, which was kind of outlining the main questions. And, you know, it seemed that was useful. This is kind of the other end of it. I'm sure we're going to get questions on the website from people saying, I heard that the CFM TV was tested. Do you have the results? And what we would have to do is send them to every one of you and you can give them the report. But there would be no composite of, you know, one, what was consistent across all the findings, and 2, for things that weren't consistent, why not? Because you have testing going on in a lot of different countries. And it could be country context, it could be something else. So if we want to figure out a way to combine your major results some way in some kind of a cohesive factor, so at the end we might have, you know, a much shorter document that summarizes a high level. We could pull it together. We could try to pull it together from your presentations, but I'm sure it won't quite mesh. So part of what Julie and I are asking is if we could have it could be the whole group if people want to do this, but it's time and we understand that. To kind of go through what are some of the key things that we'd like everybody to report in a fairly consistent way. And even just these two presentations, you saw a lot of commonalities that would be good to have together. They both found this. They both found this variation by domain. Not everyone will have a medical screener, but for the ones that do, how did that work? So it's trying to come up with a not too burdensome way of combining high-level results that we can share early on so that you can think about it when you are doing your analysis to try to feed that back to us. We raised this early on about whether this is an objective of the group, and pretty much there was agreement that this would be useful. So we're assuming that's still what you're thinking about, and this is one way of going about it. But again, as Julie said, there are probably others that we haven't thought about. We're very open to that.
Any initial thoughts or reactions to that proposal or suggestion for a different way to go about this? So how about some reactions in terms of like a thumbs up or something if this sounds like a viable way to move forward? How's that? Thanks, Elena and Rebecca and Julia. And Anne.
Yeah, I think it's a very good idea, whether it's just pulling results or also sort of, if you like, repository-driven questions. I personally would be very interested to actually know across all these settings where the tool is currently being tested, what are the questions that people are answering, in which context. Ideally, I would like to understand more sort of methodology and sort of which schools are used, because that's I think is quite important, which types of schools, which types of learners, a little bit about sampling, because without that information and the regional questions, it would be very difficult to interpret the relevance of the findings. If we could find a way to share all this, even if it's a mini, it doesn't have to be a full protocol of the study. If people are prepared to share it, that would be ideal. But, at least the questions and the key sort of methodology and the sampling and the type of sort of the population where this study was done, that would be very useful. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments from anyone who wants to come online? If you have ideas or have seen examples of such a product, many of you work in settings where you have multiple projects going on, and if that is something that you have an example of that you want to share with us, we would be happy to take a look at that. So let's move forward with the idea of at least bringing together a number of you who are interested for a second conversation to discuss, to begin discussing a product. It seems to be, it might be easier if I send out an email after this meeting. I'm going to ask a number of questions and hopefully get answers from you. And one of the first questions will be, would you like to be part of the group that is going to discuss a product, whatever that is? That email, I'm looking at the time, we have 8 minutes. So let me go through some other things that I would probably put in that email and ask for your input on. The first thing is, if you have any final comments about that best practices document that I circulated with the agenda. I think our plan for that is to put a version number, version date on that document and go ahead and put that on the Washington Group website. That way if we update it in the future, especially as a result of anything that we do going forward, then we can change the version. But this is one way of going ahead and making that document accessible, but acknowledging that it might, be subject to change. It's a living document. So I will probably ask again any last comments on that best practices. Then I'll probably also ask you to update my distribution list. I think, some of the project team members that were here with us in the first meeting probably have moved on, and now there are new project members. I don't necessarily have all those emails, especially in instances where you've shared this meeting invite, which I'm happy that you did, but I don't necessarily have the contact information for some of the people that have joined us today. Okay, so best practices document, a results thing, the project mapping. I may send that out and ask for updates to that. And these are very high level, where are you in the project? What country are you working in, that kind of thing. It should not be a burden, and we don't want to be a burden. And then the final thing that I'll probably ask in that email is, while it is still early, we're a ways away from the Washington Group annual meeting. Many of our members, would be very keen to hear some of the results that you are reporting out here, and that you are also gathering if we didn't hear today. So I may ask for some volunteers for the annual meeting. Those sessions do not necessarily have to go 2 hours, but we haven't planned the agenda for the annual meeting. So if you can let me know that whether you'd be willing to participate and present on the project at the annual meeting, that would be great. Even if you are tentatively interested, not knowing the date of the actual meeting, that would be helpful as well. So I'll send out this email. It'll have a number of things to react to. I'd appreciate a response. Any final thoughts or questions or anything you want to ask of us that you thought you would hear today? Yes, Julia is putting together, this is in the chat. Julia is putting together a panel of presentations for the CIES 2024 conference. And she's asking that if you're interested in participating in that conference to email her. Julia, if you want to add to the chat the dates for that conference and the costs associated with attendance or where it's going to be, that might, oh, there you go. She just put the link in the chat. Very nice. Thank you very much. Okay, so I think what we will do is we're gonna close. Thank you so much for your participation. I think we will schedule our next meeting for very early in September to try to avoid the summer months. And I do think we may have a couple of additional presentations at that time. Any final thoughts? Okay. I love it when meetings end early, or at least on time. Have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.